Recently, last Epoch got patch 0.8.3, which brought us Act 9, and Act 9 brought us a bunch of really dangerous aimbot enemies that will kill you because they can hit you and you can't do anything about it. Except, aimbot enemies can't hit you if they're permanently stunned to death. Thus I present to you the Lightning Blast Static Orb Sorcerer, a shocking build that's got plenty of defenses, plenty of damage, and the ability to keep your enemies from moving forever. It's got fast clear. This video was brought to you in part due to the generous support of my YouTube channel members and patrons. More about how you can support at the end of a video, but if you want to help for free, you can do so by feeding the algorithm gods and leaving a like on the video, or turning on bell notifications so that you see whenever I upload. So let's get into some of the things that make the build tick. In this showcase, I'm going to go over some of the decision making behind the skills, and why I'm using both Lightning Blast and Static Orb in combination rather than one or the other. I'll also touch upon some important gear pieces. I wouldn't say there's required uniques, but there are required idols, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. The core of a build is abusing Static Orb as a generic buff and massive nuke, while abusing Closed Circuit with Lightning Blast to buff the Static Orb to make it even stronger so you don't have to deal with the mana downside of your Static Orb, which is buffed from spending massive amounts of mana. But before I get into the gearing section, let's talk a little bit more about the skills in detail. Starting with utility skills. The first utility skill that I have is not on my bars, and that is Flame Ward. I'm using Astonish so that it triggers whenever I'm stunned, which you can see as get hit hard, Flame Ward procs, take almost no damage for the next 4 seconds. It gives me a 60 to 70% reduction in incoming hit damage, and gives me a large bubble of ward, which has really saved my life time and time again in these monoliths. So I'll get stunned, I'll take a big hit, and then I won't die to it. This, in combination with my endurance, means this build is really hard to kill. Next up, I use Teleport as my move skill. It feels impossible to play last Epoch, or really any game without a movement skill. It's just so handy to get out of danger, position yourself, and move efficiently. Unfortunately, I don't have a specialization slot for it. If you really wanted to specialize it, you could instead drop your specialization on Arcane Ascendance. You will lose a powerful damage cooldown. This build has so much damage though that you don't actually need the cooldown, which is kind of terrifying. And speaking of, I'm also using Arcane Ascendance. This is a damage steroid that gives me a bunch of cast speed and some extra spell damage, at the cost of adding a flat 5 mana to every Lightning Blast that I cast. Also, because I have Overload with unlimited power, I am passively casting Lightning Blast when I'm casting everything else with Arcane Ascendance up, meaning my damage goes from Mega to Giga. That said, this build has so much damage that if you wanted to just specialize Teleport for the quality of life, you could totally do that. You don't need the Arcane Ascendance. Alright, enough of those boring defenses. How do I kill things? I'm sure that's what you're asking right now. And don't worry, I have an answer for you. My general rotation is to open with Static Orb from a distance. This is because, number 1, Static Orb is a massive nuke that hits really hard. And number 2, it costs a lot of mana. And number 3, its damage ramps from distance covered. So I want to throw it from as far away as possible. Then I get closer to the enemy and throw out a bunch of Lightning Blasts. This chains back to me, which ramps my damage, which also gives me back mana for my Static Orb so that I can use Static Orb to keep my Lightning Aegis up for my Lightning Blast, because that's what makes me cast super fast. These two skills form a synergistic loop, by which casting more Static Orbs lets me cast more Lightning Blasts, which let me cast more Static Orbs. And the whole thing reaches a relatively efficient mana equilibrium, as long as I don't use Arcane Ascendance all that much. With a little bit more mana regen, such as if I had mana regen on both rings, something that I'm working on, I could probably reach a far better equilibrium even using Arcane Ascendance on cooldown. For Static Orb, the most important passive is Mana Charged. This turns it into a massive nuke, as I have about 350 mana, and in better gear could probably scale that up to about 400. In addition, I use Atomic Manipulation so that I don't have to use Focus. If I didn't have Atomic Manipulation, I'd probably have to drop Arcane Ascendance, and instead specialize Focus to use Focus to get all my mana back, to be able to keep spamming my Static Orbs. But instead, Atomic Manipulation gives me 75% of my mana back, as long as I spam a little bit of Lightning Blast after that orb. For Lightning Blast itself, It is built into all of the cast speed and extra casts, and all of the chains. The most important thing here is Closed Circuit. Closed Circuit gives you massive boss melting damage, as long as you're able to stand still and cast at relatively medium range. Which means, if you get to stand still, you ramp your damage up hugely. To show this overwhelming power, I'm going to stand here spamming on a dummy for a bit. Without really spamming, with just having put up my Lightning Aegis, I have about 42% crit chance and 523% increased lightning damage. And as I spam, you will see it rapidly jump to over 100% crit chance and up to 800% increased damage. In a realistic fight, when you're moving around and dodging boss mechanics, it won't go quite this high, but 80+% crit chance and 700% plus lightning damage is perfectly reasonable, and that is massive, which is how I get most of a build's DPS. I just stand there, and I Lightning Blast, and then I throw a Static Orb, maybe dodge, root myself with Arcane Ascendance, and back to spamming that Lightning Blast. So now that I've talked about the build and the skill mechanics, let's get into a little bit of the gearing. So, in terms of gearing and stat priorities, you want as much cast speed and crit multi as possible, and that's what you should prioritize on your prefixes. On your suffixes, you should prioritize Endurance, Life, and Resists. After your resist capped, look for Endurance, Life, Dodge, Armor, and all the usual defensive goodness. However, you're going to have a bad time if you play this without these Swift idols. The Swift modifier gives you up to 19% cast speed per idol while you have Lightning Aegis. Since you trigger this all the time with your Static Orb, you should have 100% uptime on 44 to 76% cast speed. I tried playing the build for about 30 hours without these idols because they just weren't dropping for me, and it felt terrible. I was struggling and really looking for what to do to make the build better. The minute I got 2 of them to drop in the same day, because clearly complaining about things in games makes them happen, the cast speed felt amazing. Everything smoothed out, and the build has been cruising ever since. I went from feeling like Orbis was taking 2.5 minutes to killing him in a little over 60 seconds, and most of the other monolith bosses feel about the same. So this build is very reliant on cast speed, as without it you're not properly ramping with Closed Circuit. Another useful but not required item is the Storm-Carved Testament off of Lagan. It offers Lightning Pen, additional shock chance to shred enemy res, mana to scale your Static Orb into an even bigger nuke, easily getting you over 300 mana for the scaling thresholds, and summon the Storm Totem. The totem's largely worthless, but at least it occasionally shocks things for you. And finally, an Undead Scroll fixes your crit. You'll want a 5 or 6% roll, and as useful stats as you can get, such as some crit multi or some cast speed. As I have around 2,000 health and Flame Ward, I didn't really feel like using a shield was necessary on this build. If you're playing hardcore, you might want to go with a shield, and you might want to go with block, because you definitely have more damage than you actually need. From my experience so far, the build has gone through content like a knife through butter. A very, very hot, electrically charged knife. It feels amazing. There's really no better feeling than walking up to a diamond matron and stunning her to death while laughing because she doesn't get to call her skybeam down onto your face. Static Orb is great at gathering enemies together, and Lightning Blast chains through them super quickly because you get 2 extra chains from using a Static Orb first. The build is incredibly quick for clearing, and I often go through an Echo in a minute to a minute and a half, even when there's some stacked up defensive modifiers. The only time it tends to take longer is if I get lost, but I don't think that's the build's fault. Similarly, Orbis is no problem. I might not be able to stand still and face tank all of his moves, but I can get hit by a lot of them. And this means I have plenty of opportunities to pop Arcane Ascendance and take a large chunk off of his health, like when you juggle an enemy in your combo in a fighting game. It took me about 6 attempts to get my Lightning Shred from Lagan, all of which was done in Empowered Monoliths with Ramping Corruption, so I am fairly sure that this build would be totally fine in 200 to 300 Corruption, if not more. I just haven't pushed that far, as progress doesn't carry over from character to character, and I only started the build fairly recently. While playing this, I did try to experiment with integrating several other mechanics, such as spark charges on my Lightning Blast, which felt really good until they didn't, where it was quite good on clear but inconsistent for single target. This feels like it would be better off as its own build, possibly some sort of trigger-based Spellblade. Similarly, the Static Ground on Static Orb with crit multi-scaling was a huge points investment, and it felt really awkward as I couldn't get both the mana recovery stuff and the mana scaling Static Ground stuff if I was building around the whole Lightning Blast synergy. That also feels like it'd be better done as its own build. But I'm curious, what have other people done with Sorcerer, and how are you playing Lightning Blast or Static Orb? Does this look better, or have you found something that you think is more efficient? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below, along with if you decide to check this build out, play it for yourself, how far you get in either Arena or Monoliths. Thank you for watching, and again, a special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. If you want to support me, you can do so by clicking the links down in the description below, or on screen right now. You can also support by making purchases through my Nexus page. Or if you just want to chill and hang out, be sure to join the Discord. Again, links for everything are down in the description below. Thank you, and have a great day.